Hello everyone, today we talk about the Longobards, our early love. Some of you have asked me to make more Longobard history videos from quite a while now, and objectively they haven't come up in the usual cycle, and I admittedly was thinking about, in fact, starting something a bit more in-depth about them. Just let me know what you think about the series in the first place, because I really appreciate any insight, right? Even just some, advice, some suggestion, whatever. The Longobards, for those of you who have started following me quite early, are one of my favorite topics because at least I worked on them for a couple of years, and I still have a lot of material on them, including 160 pages that I wrote myself about them, so it's all stuff that I can share freely. I'm romantically connected to these people because of, in fact, the beginnings of my historical path. I guess it's normal when you're younger, and I see it even in the demographics of my audience, looking at the stats, which kind of subject to watch and so on. There's a lot going on behind the scenes. That the migration era is by far, I would say, the most attractive period for. I wouldn't say like just for wars reasons. I just believe that, of course, there is a lot of archetypal meaning in it that especially those who start learning history originally can grapple with for essentially acquiring that realization that, let's say, at least some characterization of these peoples that was done throughout the centuries was never devoid of some true basis that tends to be twisted a bit according to the current fashion or whatever, and that really deserve actually a lot of consideration, if anything, as I explained, especially in the last year in the videos in which I talked mostly about the universal concept of the virtus, of the imperium, of the sense of actually shared values that existed in the world, right? Back in the day. I don't even want to qualify the eras per se, because also these peoples didn't really count the eras the way we do today. That deserves to be resumed and appreciated for what it objectively sparks in terms of tradition, but also of historical accuracy. Because really, this is a sidebar, but I believe that the YouTube history telling is in crisis to this point. I haven't been thinking of quitting or anything like that, but I realized that it's become ever more difficult to properly finding an audience that cares about historical accuracy. Right, it's obvious. I will surely make a video about this soon, because there are probably certain genres of videos that are appearing, like history vlogging, right? People basically copying entire videos and just commenting during 1/10 of that and getting, I don't know, 100 or 1,000 views, but without any actual expertise, and saying two things that do not properly even make sense. Even in these videos, right? Patching together whatever you find online and not getting to the point, not framing the period by any criterion, reflecting essentially the failure of mankind, right? In terms of spreading kind of paranoia, kind of superstitious beliefs, the sense that, I don't know, the common people are normal heroes, martyrs, and there are some evil forces outside, which is the denial of any traditional meaning. That is to say, properly, if you are not able to take control, you actually deserve whatever your status, your condition is. This is what the Longobards believed in, for that matter. And that's why I believe that telling this story, which I think we can easily extend to lots of aspects. Right? For now, I'm thinking especially of the, say, pre-Italian history of the Longobards, so from Scandinavia to basically Pannonia, would be an interesting start. in depth, right? Looking at it chapter by chapter. But in the broader accomplishment of these people, that instead mostly takes place during the phase of the kingdom proper, and that, as you know, given that I often make videos about the Italian Middle Ages, the early medieval centuries especially, and so where the Longobards are the protagonists, you still realize that the most, when I say most updated, doesn't mean, we discovered this 5 years ago, right? We discovered this 70 years ago, right? And the fact that in terms of Longobard civil, statal, institutional accomplishment, right? In the broader, by the way, Latin Germanic world, because basically at the end of the 7th century, there wasn't any larger, more powerful polity that was so territorially extended as the Longobards. Even the Franks had basically collapsed into 4 distinct realms. Is a chapter in medieval pop culture that practically, it's not even that it has been removed, but probably has never existed, right? This entire notion, and this clashes very much with what I was saying before, that is to say, together with that sense of paranoia and superstition and sort of conspiratorial delusions, there is also the sense that anything civilized is actually a scam, a trick to make you pretend that, living like a savage actually has anything to do with being an accomplished human being. All these peoples believed exclusively in world domination. There was not a single people from, say, the Roman Empire to the most actually peripheral tribes like the same Vinali who left for Scandinavia, most likely. We'll see perhaps better in the following chapters, that didn't actually believe that not just the stronger had to rule over the weaker, but that the ultimate goal was, of course, reuniting mankind under the guidance of a sole ruler that would essentially bring the entire universe to the one. Right, so nobody really understands in this picture, especially in the Holy Roman Empire that was, in this sense, Catholic and Roman in a very specific sense, right? That was a metaphysical one by the time of the Ottonians, formally recognized and lasting until the 19th century. What kind of merit would exist in being essentially a withdrawn, paranoid, weak, person who is not able to accomplish anything, to just want to be left alone? This is what leftist whiners basically are in terms of safe space, right? So what actual, and let's be honest about it, it's National Socialism. As you know, I've always been thought that nationalism is the first step into communism, because, if your standards as an actual person are the ones of the average person living over a piece of dirt and under a flag, I don't know, looking around any country in the world, how not to see that as the identification with an abortion of the dignity of mankind, especially by traditional standards, right? And this entire, of course, era we've been, like the last generations, to put it in this way, have naturally been a lot about this specific aspect, right? Because we have put in discussion not just Western civilization, but together with it, the meaning of civilization itself. And that's where you understand really the left and the right, exactly by pretending to identify in function of one another, have completely lost, of course, any sense of transcendence, any sense of what it actually means to self-sacrifice in holy combat to achieve immortal transfiguration and divine unity. So this is something definitely you do not hear from any politician right now. Well, just know that these peoples at the time believed exclusively this, right? And everyone involved, right? There wasn't the also 19th century BS that were these peoples were the good ones, these were the bad ones in terms of, this ones believed exclusively this and this other the opposite of it. Everybody recognized that, right? With different degrees of, fall, right, of mankind, but as the most obvious and unique soul creed, soul belief, they would just interpret in the limits of how what the current humans were manifesting in terms of that transcendental redemption, right? And basically nothing else, right? So it's needless to say that we live in a world where, of course, the average person, by not knowing literally anything of this, mirrors completely the fact that these ideas have been totally removed, right? And even those who try to resume it, they're just making essentially collectivistic aestheticism, right? It's just basically another degeneration of socialism, just a national socialism, right? You cannot embody in that regard a sense of nation as something that doesn't have the mission to actually dominate the world in a transcendental fashion. Thus, without the possibility of defending any kind of isolationism, any kind of this is this and this or that, and we should just be out there without thinking anything about what happens in the world or blaming, boots on the ground and things like that, because that also has deeply seated in as the new religion of the fourth estate, of the people that, again, have basically lost any chance of transcending in that regard. And I think that this topic is particularly spot on for today's one, because rather than talking about the very origin, we can do it in another episode. We should clarify what we intend for, especially for gens, right? Because rather than Nazio, right, the thing here emerges as who were these people, right? What was the actual identity laying behind a group like the Longobard one? You can't call it really a confederacy, because as we will see now, the Longobards have a pretty strong sense of their own unitary identity as a people, right? Their entire mythology revolves around a level, right, of superiority that doesn't lay, like, for example, with the gods or other some of the peoples were basically created by the Romans as kingdoms, very differently from the Longobards, that had an intrinsic, inherent value in the people, right? That is to say, the human level, right, was so high, right, that they preferred it to any kind of, let's say, single kind of sclerotically established leadership or hierarchy. This is, again, particularly important because this is not between distinguishing two forms of government from one another. That's also a superstition. It's sclerotic. What here means is that the people were living within that standard, were actually up to that standard. This is something that actually saved even the Longobards during the wars against the Gepids, that, for example, had a very strong elite, right? But they had very much poorer, say, commoners than the Longobards, and this surely contributed to the final Longobard victory over this population. There's all the issue of the hours, but as far as we understand, in that case, the Longobards really also made it practically. From their side, at least on their own, like they had managed to survive into this terrible meat grinder that Central Europe really was, right? Again, today I don't want to digress on that story, because there will be time, and I already made videos about that, to look at this specifically in depth, more in depth than what we have ever done. But this sense of quality and value of the individual was deeply felt among the Longobards. There is much that puts these people basically at the head, let's say, of the hierarchy of importance for Germanistics. Basically, if you want to study the Germans, the Norse, whatever, the Longobards, by far, considering, as we will see now, exactly their own origins and their myth in the Origo Gentis Longobardorum, and later, just for the fact that they didn't, unlike the Burgundians or the Goths, etc., their institutions weren't modeled on the Roman ones, right? Admittedly, they were actually, you can argue, the most Romanized, in spite of all, when they settled in Italy within the first generations, but they didn't model their institutions like those who had been under Rome, nor they tried to compromise with that sense of being under the empire. They wouldn't. This should make us open another parenthesis, asking what they would have done on the longer run, whether they would have resumed at some point an imperial reference per se, because they did remain objectively, like in the early Middle Ages, just within their own regional boundaries, and it's only towards the very late phase that they would have managed, if it hadn't been for the Frankish invasion, to take over Rome, right? And so at that point, there had already been, by the way, a sense of Longobard protection over the Romans and so on. So this is fantasy history, like, because we don't know what would have happened, but you could speculate on what the solutions regarding even the continuity with the Roman Empire that was achieved with the Franks and the Ottonians would have gone otherwise. That is also very interesting, because these were all very different peoples in many ways. Just think about between the Franks and the Saxons, but even between the Franks and the Longobards was a substantial difference, for which the Franks deep inside admired enormously these people with whom they were actually allied throughout most of their history, exactly because they, as a Germanically identified people, had never compromised with the Roman influence, right? And this can be explained in many ways. Also, the fact that they were naturally just bordering with the Byzantines. They were very precocious in understanding the essentially the unavoidable Italian character of their domination, because that's how they began to style themselves Reges Totius Italia, exactly to essentially stress how in this local competition they had the upper hand over the Byzantines, and the ultimate goal would have been essentially the unification of the peninsula. And with important ambitions, it would have probably at that point overflowed, and so that's when you start wondering how the thing would have really gone if the Carolingians hadn't arrived. But that's a completely different chapter. The point I was making naturally is this sense of their own political unity, in a sense, which is also a big word. Things change naturally, dramatically, from the times of Pannonia to the ones of Rotary, let's say, deterritorialization, the sedentarization, right? So the unavoidable changes, the essentially absorption of the Romans, the establishment of a kingdom, were all, very different mechanisms from ones that regulated those people when they were still in the Barbaricum, right? But it's one of those chapters that cannot be, in fact, bypassed or just superficially treated, and it deserves all of our attention, right? What we notice is that among the Longobards of the 8th century that were Catholic and spoke Latin, right, and that had been, for this reason, also largely Romanized, this is the point I care about, right? Because this is the profile. You have a completely Germanic kingdom, institution, juridical identity. Basically, all these Italians have become Germans. I made a video about this, right? They believed they were Longobards. They were known abroad, like by the Arabs, by the Franks. This place was called Langobardia, right? But these people spoke Romance, right? They wrote in Latin. They legislated in this. They had written down their own ethnic code in Latin and so on, right? So I understand that most YouTube channels out there do not even recollect with this kind of coexistence, right? They have to say this is either Germanic or this is a Roman, right? If you reason like this, it's over, right? You can't stop studying, learning anything, not just about the early Middle Ages or these people, like about the entire history. I mean, if that level of complexity and superimposition, which is also very, very small, actually, doesn't really properly pop out in your mind, like, what are the odds that you're going to get any other historical issue, right? This is a bit the problem. Sometimes you make videos about the Longobirds that were quite articulated, such as the passage from the early medieval serfs to Massari in Longobard, Italy, or things like that, and maybe you had just one person commenting, one, I don't know how many, solely for a big toe, like from the Rotary, but unfortunately, it is that. At some point it's frustrating. Sometimes it's also funny, right? To try to actually expose the audience to this, to these concepts when you understand that, unfortunately, in spite of any goodwill, there isn't much of that, precondition that you should at least have acquired in order to access these topics in the first place. I know it's hard, but I try, right? And I don't know how successful I am, but again, you cannot treat medieval history for the YouTube average, right? I'm talking about the videos you have there, and consequently also the active damage that is done by them on the audience on a regular basis, because the level of depth of insight, of criticism, is practically non-existent, right? Here, I take 3 hours to say things, but I actually tell them, right? Imperfectly or whatever, but I actually take that step. Well, among these Longobards that also beyond any prejudice were absolutely not divided, were absolutely not anti-Roman or anti-Christian or all this BS, study the actual history, the ones from actual history books written by professionals about the Longobard kingdom, right? Not your fantasy of what you think the Longobards were, or what you've heard from your cousin, or from wherever, right? Learn actual history. There are actual history books, right? You have them accessible at very modest price, and you can at least start appreciating that historiography exists, that scholarship, again, is not working to destroy the world, from, with a conspiratorial kind of way of this modifying history for its evil purposes. If there are a bunch of extremistic fanatics that want to teach you history with historical materialism, just trash those, but just know that so much has been written by people who have absolutely nothing with that. Never think, even for an instant, that in order to be a conservative or even more a traditionalist, you can afford not to have an education, and an actual one, right? Which I don't even mean, just going to college, but actually working hard for your entire life on these topics. That's actually what having an education is. The elite, the actual traditional elite in the past, was the most educated one, by the highest degree, and especially in humanities. So again, as we were saying before, instead of running away from universities, fight the people who are there, right? Because otherwise you're just a vile coward and nothing more, and you will never be, especially. And then you will absolutely be walked over, because that's the only thing that you deserve at that point, right? History is powerful, and it's beautiful, and you cannot stop it, right? It's not written by the winners and this bullshit, because we will see how it's not, even for the Longobirds. It's not, all a conspiracy. It's not, nebulous. There are not, this deep, strange, weird philosophical interpretation of history. When you actually learn the things, the events, the dates, the names that you have been told, of course, that are worthless, exactly to remain stupid, you will actually know the thing, and nobody will fool you, right? It takes, admittedly, a very long time. It doesn't take to read 2 books, 20 books, or even 200 books. Reading has nothing to do with learning. Learning has nothing to do with studying. Studying has nothing to do with understanding. Right? Understanding has nothing to do with remembering. Remembering has nothing to do with teaching. Teaching has nothing to do with actually even just knowing enough. Right? So just know that there is a long way to go before that. You can't fool yourself nor the others about this. So in this late Longobard kingdom, let's put it in this way, just before the Franks would enter Italy, let's put it at this point, So at 2 centuries of distance from the conquest of the peninsula, by the side of their epic, but actually historical sovereign Alboin, the Longobard awareness that their history hadn't had a beginning in the Apenninic Peninsula, that they were, say, dominating as a kingdom, but of course being at this point, again, the actual people who inhabited there as a whole, because everybody had turned Longobard juridically, as we were saying before, is per se in a way it would have remained, right? There is no doubt that every people, right, coming from the migration era, had an awareness of this past. But, and this is the peculiarity of the Longobards, was radically and brutally renowned, right? The entire Longobard identity revolved fundamentally and principally about this knowledge, this historical awareness, which is very different from what happened among other peoples, because not all the Germanic peoples had, let's say, first of all, remain compact, right? Not all, as we will see, had even properly an ethnonym dating to the time the Romans conquered Germany, for example. When Tiberius was fighting on the Elbe, he found the Longobards, he crushed them, but they were called Longobards in the Roman literature of the time, which means that this was one of the very few Germanic peoples who maintained their name in their political unity throughout all the way. Right, so this thing had allowed, just per se, and its political and social implications, the survival of the Longobards up to that point. Right, we had seen naturally how this would have a prestigious future, because the Longobard kingdom, the Italic kingdom, was basically elected as the imperial one, right? Given that the Iron Crown of the Longobards was the one necessary for anyone to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. Otherwise, it was not to be done. You could have the Western Frankish one only or the Eastern Frankish one only, but you must have, without any possible contemplable exception, the Italic crown in order to, before having the Holy Roman Imperial one. And there was no way beyond that, right? That belongs to another phase of history, but remember that that crown was the Longobard one, right? It was not the Gothic one, was not the fact of the, it hadn't been founded properly by the Longobards in Italy. It doesn't matter that there had been other guys called as Reges. This had been the case also for the Goths and so on. But it's not the same thing. Institutionally, it's not the same continuity, right? That crown continued up to Napoleon, together with the Holy Roman Empire, and it was the Longobard one. So how do we know about this historical identity, right, and the origins from the north? Well, we know naturally various relations, sagas, songs existing throughout all the Longobard era, and partly beyond, right, after the Carolingian conquest of Italy. So well after that epochal year 568, right? That was, by the way, not just the only date, it's mostly the beginning of in which the majority of the Longobards entered the peninsula to settle more or less where some decades later they would have founded the kingdom in the Po Valley. But again, in spite of this fragmentation, the Longobards, that were actually also fragmented because they didn't have literally a concept of monarchy in an equally unitary sense, because they had instead a concept of unitary people, rather. This is crucial, right? You will understand that the Longobard myth is one of people. It's not like the Goths that stressed the dynastic royalty, also because, frankly, the Romans had basically made that up with their classical resources for the Goths at the time of Theodoric to provide them with a safe mythology / history of the origins, Scandinavian, all the whole thing. The Longobards, as we will see now, wouldn't have had this all this, but their own memory, right, is incredibly consistent with everything, right, including the Scandinavian origins that we can document from all the other sources that we will be seeing in this series, right? So up to Scandinavia, this prehistory dominated by what we call essentially the pagan religion, even though, again, it doesn't make any sense, nor to use the term pagan nor religion, because they actually all believed in the same ecumenic traditional divinity, and it's a big mistake, right, even just to approach the Norse. Like, if you think that Norse mythology is polytheistic or Germanic mythology is polytheistic, it means you literally have not the palest idea of what Germanistics, Indo-Europeistics, or any other religious study basically about these people really is, right? It's a grave, deep, humiliating, shameful misunderstanding of the deepest belief of these people. And you have been specifically removed this concept, right, for being the way we see the world as being today, and making you shoot against your own friends, basically, and in terms of the minimal tradition that has been surviving as a relic up to this day. So from an historical point of view, we are extremely lucky about this, because, of course, Longobard history is amazing, unique on its own. All these so-called Germanic peoples took different paths from probably a likely common region of origin. I don't think there is any doubt about this. If not the Scandinavian, but surely the Central European at that point, and what mostly we call the Germanic branch of the Indo-European peoples, is the origin. There are many reasons for this. We will see it better in the videos about the Scandinavia and the migration from it, the settlement in the Bardengau, and so on. But it's still remarkable that we basically have a major chunk of Western European Romano-Germanic identity that is founded on a body of knowledge that actually dates extraordinarily and coherently well to a time and space that are perfectly consistent with all the other information that we actually have about these peoples, right? You can argue that if you look at their migratory routes and so on, yes, more or less the people came from Scandinavia, at least the original nucleus, whatever, but we do not actually have the, let's say, the perfect evidence of that, right? This doesn't mean that it wasn't the case. It just means that how these peoples were formed was much more an along-the-way thing than, at least compared to, for what especially the great confederacies of the migration era looked like compared to the original nucleus, right? About the Longobards, we can say that we are in the presence of the closest evidence of that origin. Not even for the Longobards, we actually have the manifest proof of this, mostly because archaeology doesn't have tags. So you can start looking at groups that moved here and there. You can speculate on the base, and exclusively, by the way, on historical accounts, because archaeology doesn't do anything alone, in case you didn't notice. Regarding was Wu there? Right, so another disgusting behavior that I see around is pretending, again, there is a classicistic conspiracy theory that, removed knowledge from who knows what was happening out there. Every person should, the Germanic people should light, a candle every day to Caesar, to Tacitus, to all the historians that actually told us something in the first place, right? And that didn't have any fault if the Germans didn't have a literature, right? Just like the Gauls or others, right? And no, these kind of oral accounts do not count as that. They're, in fact, not literature, but they also reflect a different level of political and social development that evidently was just thinking about something else, right? Just the same Romans up to the 3rd century BC thought themselves that a true warrior, a freeman, that doesn't have to write, because that's an effeminate thing, right? So things change, but don't think that the origins were that distant. And everybody knows, by the way, that the Romans were biased in favor, and heavily so, of the Germans, right? They literally found an archetypal term of comparisons with the Indo-European origins of Rome, with the values of these peoples. And of course, we know also, archaeologically speaking, at least in a general sense, that the reality on the ground was much grimmer than what the same Romans depicted. And that we're doing so also for essentially flattering themselves regarding that. So, as I always say, this was an ecumenic empire, right? And whatever happened later with the shrinking of it, these peoples knew pretty damn well what this empire had been, right? And they would never unrecognize it, right? There is not a strange reality in which the terrible Romans invaded these peoples because they were playing a different rule compared to these ones, right? Everybody, as we were saying before, was recognized to be either superior or inferior, right? The myth of equality in these worlds, even among the so-called freemen, it was completely devoid of existence. We'll see it now in the meanings of gens, because that doesn't mean that if you're free, there is a standard pack of freedom that you categorically pertain to just by some strange, institution. By the way, they didn't even have at the time for regulating this, but you actually have a value, right? The Guidrigildus, right? Famously enough, also named differently depending to the transliteration in the other Germanic codes, is literally how worthy you are in terms of money. And everybody is different because everybody has a different value. So even those who are free, they just are within a spectrum of freedom, practically. And the divide, by the way, is founded on very solid premises that literally have to do with the faculty of disposing of the imperium, right? If you defeat somebody, you, of course, and this person surrenders, of course, they surrender their own freedom in an absolute sense. So they do not belong to themselves anymore, also because they made an oath right in front of God to win, right? And if they lose, right, actually they're pretty lucky to be still alive in the first place. Actually, that's a shame, right? You're not literally a human being anymore if you're defeated and you're still alive among these peoples. And as a consequence, however, you can become a slave, fundamentally, of the winner. That can give you a chance of redemption, which, as we will see among the Longobards, had a very deep meaning, right? It's not very different. Actually, it's the same identical thing of the Roman manumissio, and it is founded on a sense of retribution, right, of merit/duty, right, not differently from the Roman munus. Again, the Indo-European value, but the broader universal one, telling the truth, because they really all believe in the same thing, is identical. There is no difference whatsoever in it. Just by the political and social degree that is contingent to a given time and place and people and what we're doing about it, right? So, as we were saying before, Longobardistics is practically the only possible path to Germanistics, properly to below the Germanic peoples, the Germanic societies. You cannot understand the Norse world if you do not study the Edictum Rotary. You cannot compare properly any other rite for the one that the Longobards wrote down in the mid 7th century, because the way these the various Romano-Germanic peoples came to be and also ended very often deprived us of most of that unitary continuity. The Longobard law, notoriously enough, is at the base of the same revival of Roman law in the 11th century. The Longobardists, basically all the jurists of the Bolognese studium back in the 11th century, were all Longobardists, right? Because that was their land. It was the Kingdom of Italy / of Lombardy. They studied, first of all, the Edictum Rotary, that was still working, even for such a brutally advanced region in Europe like that one, with cities rising enormous traffic, transactions, whatever, a testament to the effectiveness of this law. Plus, they had the Carolingian one, imperial laws, and they began to to start to reconstruct Roman law on the base of the Justinian texts to essentially fill the gaps initially just of these other ledges that up to that point had basically constituted the basis. So much of the Western of medieval civilization in terms of political, civil, institutional development owes an enormous chunk of it to the same Longobard kingdom that was, let's remember it, a kingdom of cities, of literate dukes who attended trials, who judged, who literally had a pretty sound idea of what a palatium was, what a central power was, what a unitary rule actually was. And yes, the myth that the Longobards were all against one another, irreparably divided, it's a complete myth. It's been debunked from more than 3 generations. Whoever still believes in this thing should, again, go to a library, start studying pretty seriously, in this case, the Longobard institutions, seeing how they worked, how the various duchies were ruled like, and possibly even watch Schwerpunkt about it. But seriously, simply being exposed to the actual evidence. Now, what is this body of identitary memory, right? Historical identitary national memory about, right? Well, so the nucleus, the fundamental nucleus, is constituted by a history of the origins of the Longobard people as such. By the time it was written down for us to read, right, from their oldest Latin version, handed down, what would be found with the name of Origo. This story was at least generations old, right? We do not know what was the process like, surely there had been other workings before, but we understand that most of this knowledge was transmitted orally, and it was part of a broader sort of constitution of the same Longobard people, naturally in an illiterate reality, like Central Europe, like in the 6th century or before, right? So where every Longobard was identified by such system of values, just to be sent by heart, right, like that, and naturally reflecting a much broader political, military, as we will see now, and social reality. So the name is famously enough the Origo Gentis Longobardorum, so the origin of the Longobard people. Sometimes it's also translated as the saga of the stock, or the history of the origins. And surely we know this genre from other peoples of the migration era that by that point basically starts to constitute in itself properly as an autonomous type of historiography, to the point of systematic identification, right, with it. That is akin to the chronicle, to the annal, to a geography, right? Naturally, it's particular in its own regard because it documents a prehistory, right? At least the history is made now because it's finally written down, but it talks about a past that is beyond a merely temporal divide, right? Actually, ancient peoples didn't really believe in time as we do, right? It's actually a myth that they had a cyclical idea. That's what's, again, mostly leftists made me realize, the Pelagians, though, that all the Indo-European peoples had a pretty sound eschatological understanding of the world. Everybody knows this from Norse mythology, the storming of the Asgard, the Age of the Wolf, and the irreparable, like the inescapable, say, looming at least of doom over the same race of the gods, because essentially of human sin, right? The other Gnostic BS is that these peoples didn't know original sin. This means literally having not the palest idea of what the hell like Norse or Indo-European religion really is in the first place. It's about the dimming, of course, of the sacred in the heart of man, right? And the entire holy war, sacred duel, whatever, it's always it's a psychomachia, right? That naturally takes on metaphysical character. So it's obviously manifested by the imperium on earth and by crushing your enemies, cutting their heads, emptying their skulls and drinking from them, which is what the Longobards, by the way, did. Just to tell you a bit like the cute little types that crossed the Alps in the 6th century, but that had a fundamentally shared universal value at the time, and very much so. So the Origo, to make the long story short, is a historical tale, right? That has as a theme the common origins of a people, right? Now, the Origo of the Longobard people is being handed to us in a triplex form. The ancient one, the most ancient one, we named it before, is the Origo Gentis Longobardorum, which really stands on its own. Like, it was written in the 3rd, 4th of the 7th century, all in Italy, of course. And the chance has wanted us that it's always been handed down to us, fortunately, by the way, together with the Edictum Rotari, right? So the great book of laws of the Longobard king promulgated in 643. This is a huge deal because it makes you understand that the Longobard laws were coming together with their own ethnic, mythological identity, right? They believed they were all one, right? A system of values, basically, that for which the Longobards had to be reminded by learning of their law that naturally was already adapted to the Italian scenario in that sense, the one of a political and territorial power, some properly also governmental conditions that were unknown to the people up to a few generations before, but that told them, like, look, that this is who we are, right? And this is even more important when you realize that, of course, the Edictum is in Latin, was written for the Italians, and that by this point, basically, the difference between the Germans and the Romans was already null, right? At least it was completely inconvenient for anyone involved to keep it, even just theoretical. Then there is the great Longobard scholar, Paul the Deacon, a great figure on his own regard. It's a bit like, I don't know, Isidore of Seville for Spain, Gregory of Tours for Gaul, Bede the Venerable for England. This character exploited the summary compilation of the prehistory and history of the origin of the Longobard people for his famous Historia Langobardorum. That, at least as a broader work, is, of course, the most important about Longobard history, and written basically in the last quarter of the 8th century. We're already in Frankish times, by the way. It was written for the Carolingians, actually, so it ends with Luthbrand. There aren't clashes with the Franks, right? Paul was actually brother with the with the Duke of Friuli that rebelled against Charlemagne. We will actually make even a video soon, likely, about the Battle of the Livenza River. That is, nobody knows that, but it's possibly one the instance in which actually the Longobards defeated Charlemagne himself on the battlefield, but this is also, again, an optional for the masses. Now, together with the Historia Langobardorum, Paul the Deacon elaborated within his work other sources, including sagas, songs, right, on the origins of his people, and surely more, right? Unfortunately, we do not know much about them, as it's often the case for this time in history. Just God knows which were the sources that he drew from. But we know, of course, from the same work that they were consistent, and more importantly, that at the time they were still alive among the people. Right, they were still alive among the Longobards that now spoke Romance, were Longobards just by right, basically, not even necessarily by ethnic origin. Right, the Longobards were just like from 1 to 3% of the Italian population when they migrated in, and they were actually the largest people altogether of the migration era. So, albeit some regions, provinces were more affected by the settlement, and we know that also ethnogenetically. If we look at some maps of blonde hair, blue eyes concentrated, especially in the Apenninic heartland, rather than those might have been actually just the prior Italic background was more distant from the sea, and also the Ostrogothic garrisons that joined the Longobards. But you understand the sense here, is that they all together thought then that to be Longobards, right? There is another source, by the way. An anonymous Italian clergyman that, at the beginning of the 9th century, wrote a history of the Longobards, handed out to us only through the Gotha illuminated manuscript. This author used the Origo in this work as well, but we know that he disposed of also other written and oral sources, for which his version of the Longobard Epos, especially in the origins, has a very strong particular character. We will see these things, again, we will make properly the history of the people, step by step. It's always very interesting to read these sources. We will do it explicitly at some point, but again, the background is important. With every source, in every historical context, you must understand where the source comes from, right? What was the context in which it was written, why, for whom, whatever. History is about the critical inquiry, right, of the sources. So not merely basing and copying, like as if you were shopping in a supermarket, just whatever you wish to be true. It's not how it works technically. It's important in any case to stress that among the Longobards there was such a tradition, a very ancient one, but still alive in the 8th century, of tales, of songs on their past, that in fact was also written in nature at this point. They surely began to write it down as soon as they had somebody that would do it initially for them. Then eventually literacy spread. This was actually the most literate region likely in the world at this time. And we know how the Longobards basically still, went to the circus, watching, the chariot races in places like Milan, like behaving like almost Roman emperors. And so you understand in that context the awareness about these people's hardcore identitary belief was obviously spread osmotically to even take over the entire Italian space. Now, there is a big deal about this type of sources, and it's a huge one, especially if I consider that most of my audience is American, because unfortunately, and that I have very positive ideas towards this culture, but there are always pros and cons, and unfortunately one of the cons is that especially like the scholarship in the Anglosphere, broadly meant, has spread this paranoid distrust ever since they began to write history in a way towards the source, right, and conferring instead a disproportionately undeserved prestige to scholarship per se, and everything that is especially narrative literature is looked upon with atrocious suspicion, distrust. Oh my God, it's just a narrative sources, it's not reality, it must be false by default. The reasons are deep, right? Indeed, having had just like a monarchy, a monarchy in a sense, rather than more communal government does make a difference throughout history. You do have surely some biased authors historically, but I've been working with sources, mostly studying the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, Germany. That's mostly my field. Of course, just for every source in the first place, even if they are lying outright and you know it, they are telling you still an enormous amount of hard, real facts about the world they're writing from, right? And in any case, they're doing it for a purpose that, again, is even more telling than what they're actually spelling out, right? But secondly, they're people of enormous intelligence, right? I've been working on medieval sources for that easily. These people are way smarter, way more politically literate, much more strategically educated, and socially aware than anything that I know today as an average. There's no average. Admittedly, these people were not average people even at the time, and there is surely a selection in the classical canon for which we remember the classics, but fortunately, to some degree, we do not remember all the trash that was produced at the time that was, treated as such, evidently for us to lose track of it. And this already by itself, for the tradition of a people like the Longobards, that, as I told you, were called like that by the time the Romans found them in Germany in the 1st century AD, well, is of such an unspeakable value that I don't need even to insist on. Unfortunately, though, some scholars will try to trick you in the other direction, say this is not... You see, of course, we do not believe literally everything the sources say, but we must understand why they say it, right? And what the side of the scholarship has most... And there are also Europeans, by the way. I'm not just making it... I mean, continental Europeans, not making the case. This is just a problem of the Anglosphere, but mostly it is of the Anglosphere. Have tried instead to tell you that basically that these sources are not even important, or it's just fairy tales, or they were made up, or they were just, something, a literary divertissement or something like that, right? This is lunacy, to say the least, a true crime against mankind in the first place. So let's put it this way. Some scholars deem the historical, trustworthiness of these sources to be very limited or even inexistent. Right, in general, this is not true just for the Longobards, right, that are actually some of the most reliable, as we were pointing out before, but the history of the origins in general are treated as either myths or sagas that, in the best of the cases, would express something of the ideas that the peoples had of their own origins in the far past, and that at least were important as an instrument, right, to consolidate some essentially political identity in early medieval times, and especially after the migration during the settlement. So where things were really changing a lot among them. So the purpose would be showing, legitimizing essentially the homogeneity and the compactness of a gens that we will now explain in the meaning, the etymology is the one of genes, right, of genetic, right? It has literally to do with the offspring, with begetting, etc. And also to, by the way, highlight, exalt the, say, the peculiarities of the peoples compared to others, or also to aggrandize the legitimacy of an institution like the one of the kingdom or of a dynasty, so transposing it in a far past. Naturally, all of these doubts are legitimate. Obviously, in every single Origo, there is such a thing. It's obvious that while Rotary was inserting in the act, because we know how they wrote it in Pavia's palace, like, you know, the actual law was issued, right, and they signed it in the formal version to insert the Origo at the beginning of that. Of course, at that point, you are basically saying, I'm the king. The kingdom had already been established from quite a while and not being really, contested as such by anyone, especially by that point. And so we are the warranters of the people's identity, laws, in fact, government, unity, and so we are literally the kings of Italy as well. We show this in front to our opponents, by the way, to the Byzantines, to whomever was thinking that at least this institution could be legitimate for some reason, including part of the same Longobards. At least, you know, there was, as I just said, no major, contrast at that point. Authority had taken care of that by beheading half of the Longobard dukes in the Po Valley that still thought to act in a decentralized position as Byzantine Summacoi/Federati. After that, again, not even Spoleto, not even Benevento, they were actually pretty cooperative, right? They never said, "No, this kingdom doesn't represent them." And the reason why this was the case, by the way, because in other parts of Europe, we literally have entire chunks. Let's leave aside the Heptarchy, it was formed like that, but, even in Spain, Visigothic Spain, or in the same Francia, or among other people, like, there was a more kind of, first of all, oligarchic orientation, which we have described very often compared to the Longobards instead, that were had a very spread, wealth, right? But because exactly the Longobard identity was based on that deep unitary belief, to a point that we will have also to explain during the migration phase, right? And why the Longobards had developed this very specific people, identity, and with such courageous confidence in it, right? And don't think that this doesn't have to do with things like civic humanism or with Italian Renaissance, with great part of European modernity, because there is actually a fil rouge having to do connecting with all these passages. The Lombard League, the sense of the opposition to constituted order, but still within the order and within the hierarchy, which is our foundational concept of liberty. This is excruciatingly important, right? The Longobards had recognized, for example, to have been conquered by the Franks. That's why also they were proud subjects of the Holy Roman Empire, but wanting their rights to be respected, right? And that's how the system still worked traditionally. But again, we will have time in preparing something also about, generally speaking, the Renovatio Imperii, the role of the Germans in medieval Ghibellinism and all this stuff, so stick around if you're interested in that. Even some of the most insightful scholars say that the past is malleable because you can modify it depending on the circumstances of the present, whatever. But again, it's the usual moral relativism concerning the half empty or half full glass of water that really do not. It's representative of our contemporary times, but it can be useful as a healthy dose of skepticism always is, but it's not the deal. We want to know the deal. We want a historical, objective reality, which we can definitely get closer and closer to when we look at least the evidence that we really have. We'll see it more clearly, especially about the Scandinavian origins, because as I said about that, we just miss a ring of the chain, but we have, at least in the actual archaeological sense, or any other proof rather than a saying that the Longobards were originally of Scandinavia. But if that's literally the only source we have, and it tells us that, and generally speaking, of course, together with what we know about these peoples, that is more than plausible. Why should we stop to okay, we just don't know point, so it's not necessarily true? Well, let's go by kind of yes, right? Also because who cares whether it was exactly Scandinavia or just northern Germany, whatever? It doesn't matter really. But we have Scandinavia, so let's stick to it, right? Let's give trust to this source, and let's understand why that was the case. And I usually don't do it that easily. For the Goths, for example, I'm very much more critical, at least because I like to stress how they came to be, even just the Amali and properly the Gothic monarchy on the long run, both the gods of the West and ones of Italy, to be that, and to create their own historiography through the Roman scholarship that at the time was working for them. So in a completely different reality. But even in that case, probably yes, the Goths did have in their own originary nucleus a Scandinavian origin, probably. Right, there's nothing strange about that. We see that the path is more or less the same across the Vistula River and then down there to different directions, but those are the vectors, right? So what is strange with it? What would be inconsistent with it, right? Without, of course, taking away the fact that the Goths were a much more made-up people than the Longobards, by the way. They're also sometimes credited as this sort of just dramatic mix, but even just ethnically, ethnogenetically, we see things like, I don't know, there were some Slavs with them, there were some Iranians with them, things like these. There are sure similarities between the Saxons, even the Anglo-Saxons, and the Longobards, because the old Saxons basically took the place of the Longobards after they migrated up to the rising up the Elbe Valley. But other than that, we see, doesn't matter how strong the Hunnic influence was, the Reitervölker impacting Longobard culture, lifestyle, zootechnic capacities, whatever. I mean, they look pretty Germanic in nature. Just even properly the basics of their own social section, we realized they were essentially at best a semi-nomadic people, and still fundamentally a sedentary one. Because the migration took a very long time, by the way, meaning that they moved also not unitarily at the beginning. We're talking centuries, so of course mostly they were staying somewhere, without turning nomadic or whatever. But we will talk again about these things in yet another video. So on the background of this prevalently and sadly so negative historicity of the oral tradition, there is, of course, also the heuristic value of any possible use of the sources in a historical sense. So there is one interesting aspect about the Origo that, in a sense, is also jarring with the Christian and soon completely Catholic Longobard religion. That is to say that in the text of the Origo, you have an integral part of the pagan cult. Yes, right. This was not seen, even in clean contrast, even by the religious authorities that were not making a fuss about this. Again, some people pretend that the spread of Christianity was just, what happened between Charlemagne and the Saxons, and that especially, again, this continuous perennial, this is perhaps the single most difficult thing to eradicate, the fact that these religions were categorically different, Right? People actually believe that there is such a thing like monotheism and a thing like polytheism. I mean, they do not understand that they belong to a spectrum that actually believes in the same identical thing. In any case, it's still, evident that Longobards attributed to this to their history of the origins, first of all, a divine character. In other words, as we will see, that the Longobards took their own name as essentially Boden's adoptive sons. This link was essentially imperial in nature. Was surely warlike, but properly it had to do, and of course there were other Germans who had this bond, in a sense, also because Boden is the actual father, so it's basically D1, right? The rest being just an hypostasis of the same. So any divine descent, as we will see now, was of course from Boden, in a broader sense, aside from the other archetypal anthropological meanings attached to him in the story, because also these peoples again were passing from say essentially a merely spiritual sort of metaphysical sense of force to the actual personification of, in fact, what we improperly think it was like a polytheistic system, because we see different characters, different gods, but it to them it was at least still in this era very clear what that actually meant. It was not different from still the sense of sainthood existing in Christianity at that point, and what actually sainthood meant, even along the pattern of of Christian geography, especially after the deep Romanization in a military sense, in fact in Latin Germanic Europe especially, but not all. Made multiple videos about this. So this sense of being a chosen people is yet another thing that, as you know, recurs dramatically in history. The chosen people were not just the Jews. It was an incredibly common thing. The Romans were the chosen people par excellence. The Franks were the chosen people. Right, so by this degree, the Longobards were the chosen people, because the myth, we will read it at a point, and the history is famous, like Boden literally recognizes and chooses divinely as his own children. He names them as the Longobards, right, and he gives them victory in battle, which is beautiful, right? The enemies were the Vandals, by the way, and there is a deep connection between the Longobards. If you look at the Germanic, the Oscari, the Vinil, the Vandil, they are essentially them. And so that's, you understand why they cared so much about this, because their own divine ancestry was actually stressed. This is what historiography today doesn't stress that much, because it sounds pretty much eugenetic, sort of Nazi sounding or whatever, but that's what they actually meant, at least on a ground of history or religions. That's the only actual meaning that the thing really has, and we do not care what kind of other people with specific propagandistic motivations make of this. This is the actual history. I mean, the Romans believe in the same thing about themselves. Other peoples, and again, the interesting thing is that they were competing in a communal awareness, right, of this issue, because all humanity is fallen from God, from the divine unity, without exceptions, just different degrees of how low you have fallen and how much you have been able to rise up. That's why, as people, their own untamed sense of liberty was stressed so much, because this had been proven on the battlefield throughout the migration era, like when there is to be wiped out by other peoples that instead were crushed by the Longobards and wouldn't have a future, actually, in all this, at least as an independent identitary determined people, right? This is quite important. So this character of sacred tradition prevented, by the way, such texts also to simply be reformulated freely in a sort of poetic vest later on. That's why the Longobard monarchy appropriates it of itself when they were issuing their own legal code in the kingdom, the realm. So this is, by the way, why in the 8th century Paul the Deacon, that acts a bit like the Christian skeptic, says this is just a ridicula fabula, so a ridiculous fairy tale, basically, in Latin. But he still tells it in his Historia Longobardorum. That tells everything, right, just by itself. It's this is like a children's story or whatever, because of course it was not biblical in nature. But he remembered it as a Longobard himself, as essentially tradition, in fact, handed down. That's what traditio actually means in Latin, from the connections of these people with Wodan himself. And this reveals, by the way, clearly of course, that pagan religious background of that same tradition, right? It is not also irrelevant to point out that in other cultural areas you have plenty of these notions, right? You can't go as far as, this is not just about the Germans, right? If you look at Greece or Africa or South America, you have plenty of all these stories. It's, again, completely normal. This is called tradition in the universal sense, and it means always the same identical story. The fall of mankind, the struggle to reverse the trend, and so this constant holy war that you have to fight in order to repristinate the ecumenic unity. Even more important is the fact that besides the Origo, we have a lot of Longobard sources that demonstrate how alive among the people such tradition of the historical tale was present, and especially with strong archaic traits. Philologically, literally, we realize that the stories, some are sagas, right? They're not different from Norse stuff. They tell the same things, they use the same terminology. There are some, this is interesting because they are Latin sources, but there are some words that they didn't know how to translate in Latin, and they used a sort of the same Germanic word, right? And we will see this. It's fantastic because if you cross it with other Norse sagas, etc., you find you understand what they actually believed in terms of insults. I don't know. Among warriors on the battlefield. We will look at that, the Fetile especially, between the Longobards and the Gepids, but we will talk about it on another occasion. Where do we get this from also? Well, for example, when Paul the Deacon talks about his own familiar history, he literally starts talking about the ancestor that had come to Italy back in the day, and he cares about his origins, about the fact that he was a Longobard, that he was like the offspring of the same people of that ridicula fabula, that, however, he needed still to tell. And I made multiple references to this attitude of Paul the Deacon in other videos about Germanic warfare, because he uses this sort of ridiculization as an alibi to still talk about it, and it's evident that he finds it very interesting just to tell in the first place. And again, it's not because there was anything just preventing him from talking about this stuff openly, just per se. Of course, might have created sort of embarrassment or whatever. To talk about Wodan, but as a Christian clergyman, but he still was talking freely about the stories we do not have any evidence of anyone having a problem with this at the time. I mean, Paul the Deacon, as you know, worked at the court of Charlemagne. He also was in Monte Cassino, right? So he was actually a big shot and a famous clergyman who in Europe who wrote this fantastic story, a very important moment for the history of the continent, the empire, and the same Longobards after the Frankish conquest. The importance of the Longobard ancestral connection is demonstrated by the same text of the Origo placed in the Edictum Roter, in the preface, as this text lists the same ancestors of the king that embraced 11 generations, and the same catalog of the rest of the Longobard people that comprehended 17 sovereigns, dating again to 643, right, to the same year. Now this aspect is fantastic, right? They listed their own sovereigns at the, let's say, including the ones that had not been kings of Italy, but kings of the Longobards. You see the point of this? This is the people, the living stock that matters to them, the actual divine force that had made it till there, and then dating back to the Barbaricum, right? So the very ancestral kings, because as we will see, the kings, say the Longobards had at some point, especially under the Hunnic domination, some king that was co-opted, in that case, to and so, but chosen among the Longobard clans, right, that tried to establish a sort of, in fact, of dynastic power, etc. But after the Huns, you realize that Longobards have some leaders, but they have not that monarchical trait anymore, because it was just a fruit of that specific rule, rather than a tradition among the people that instead were always traditionally distrustful of single rulers. Because the sense was that you must have a ruler, but the importance is also that every single person is strong, right? So that they can choose the better man themselves in times of need, but then the standards have to be maintained up to the point that even thinking to be ruled over by someone would be too much, right? Not like today, where lesser people think that they can't rule themselves, and cause a civilizational collapse. Instead, just because they whine about their own personal unaccomplishment. Those were people that literally ruled by themselves. The Fare were notoriously autonomous. It was a very different system, and naturally the territorialization of the settlement changed everything. You cannot rule that amount of land permanently without a monarchy, without a system to guide the thing, also with permanent structures, etc. In any case, when we look at the broader picture of historiography, we realize that from the time the Longobards enter and go out, let's say, until they go out of the radar of the Romans, essentially from classical antiquity, then from the beginning of the 6th century, right? What we know from these sources, Roman and Byzantine, is extremely coherent with the Longobard historical tradition. This is the thing that makes you understand how real is that, not just plausible, right, but also concrete, right? So this speaks definitely in favor of the reliability of the Longobard historical accounts. The Origo is definitely the most important source about the prehistory of the Longobards, because, of course, at the time they wouldn't write, and everything is cryptic in terms of course, where they moved and how. Like, we can't reconstruct them on the base of toponyms, more or less looking at with the chronology, which is say it's not so complicated, but at least the sequence of the kings when they were elected, especially when we talk about the 2nd, the 3rd century AD, is a bit complicated, but still coherent, right? Doesn't go against any major information we have in general. Like, probably there are no problems regarding it in the first place. So archaeology helps a little because we think we can track the Longobards throughout all the way from Scandinavia to Italy. Just there is a big gap after the time of Arminius. After the assassination of whom seemingly the Longobards rose to discrete power in Germany to arbiter like the situation, until again, then we know very few. We know they participated together with the Marcomanni to sound raids in the 2nd century AD, things like that. But then, until the 6th century, we do not have practically any other information but this one, the Origo. That's why it's so important. So I thought to start this series by analyzing especially the concept of gens, right? So a very malleable one, telling the truth, that it is accompanied by a number of interpretative problems. Of course, we are talking about a pre-Linnean language, far from the categorism and the encyclopedism to which we are habituated. The semantics is quite deep, right? Latin was a much more primitive and thus semantically richer language than the contemporary ones we're habituated to. And it had a broader meaning. It, however, gets down to the sense of literal reproduction. I mean, the sense of bringing someone to life through reproduction, offspring, begetting, and so on. So when applied to a people, right, and even just to translate the term like this, we have to be more careful. So it can mean a lot, right? A great family, a stock, a dynasty, a clan, a people, right? For example, the gens Amala in the 6th century sources, that is the one of the Ostrogothic kings, in fact, reigning over the gens Ostrogotarum. So the dynasty of Theodoric, etc. That is means properly the heavenly ones, the celestial ones. The meaning is always the same. These were the golden race that had basically maintained high their standards of. These are the Asen, basically, or almost, right? Something like descending from them, right? The Asen, the Aesir. And we have seen that there is a great difference between the Ostrogoths and the Longobards. Here, in the first case, we're talking about kings. Among the Longobards, that's a bit of a different thing. As we have learned, they had their own leaders. They were also very, very important. They had that came from specific clans that include the concept of stock, of blood. So this sense of personal, moral, and physical superiority that went au pair as far as this people's mentality was concerned. And it was, again, the traditional thinking for any other out there. And that, however, again, sees the Longobards as a whole as a gens. So who were these gentes, plural, right? Is it a folk? Is it a stam? A people or a tribe? I think that the term people is best, right? It's of course in English it comes from the Latin populus, which is a bit of a different thing actually from the one of the senatores that were the actual patres and probably something closer to the asen. And so this stock of chosen people. Coming straight from the gods, like more straight from the gods and so on. But at least in the semantics that people has acquired nowadays, I think it's a neutral enough term to qualify the gens, especially in the case of the Longobards, due to that aforementioned scarce stratification but quite consistent cohesion that likely allowed the people to, again, open their path through Central Europe in that meat grinder that it really was, That's where Botanism had been born. That's why the Longobards basically convert to that. Even in political identity, after they crossed the sea from Scandinavia to Germany. And that had made them remaining Longobards. It was the winning brand, right? It would maintain as such. Like the other peoples didn't have this thing. The Goths a bit maintained this name, but that was also gradually made up. Like the Terbingi and the Greutungi were something slightly different from what would be known as the West Goths and the actual Goths. Like even today we call the Ostrogoths in a way that was never called just because they were the ones of the West, but it's actually due to the Italian sources of the 6th century that, given they had the actual Goths of Theodoric in Italy, called the West Goths the ones in Spain. And so then we decided to use this term Ostrogoth that they didn't use at the time. So you see how tricky it is to name things without knowing the background, right? So in the case of the Longobards, this is instead a great indicator of political continuity. We are pretty certain that the Longobards were never broken, right? The Franks were at least born out of a confederacy of other tribes. The Alamanni, all these names were made up, right? They were an international shout-out. Actually, they stuck mostly to a tribal allegiance that existed even before the clans. Among the Longobards, instead we see that they were a people. They had different clans, and so even there, anthropologically, you can start debating where's the boundary between a clan and a tribe, and all these things. But we do not see any ethnogenesis connected to the putting together of different tribes that at least we know historically. We know at the beginning, as we will see, that the Longobards the Vinili were actually led to Germany by 2 princes. So you understand there in the story that there were different groups. And along the way in continental Europe, surely they got different groups. We do not know whether they got entire tribes within them. They absorbed a lot of people, but we do not know in which terms, unfortunately. But it seems, again, the Longobards were not, at least at the beginning of their history, many. That's what the Roman sources say, but they were quite warlike, and they seemingly took pride of essentially being at war contemporarily with all the neighbors. Yeah, those were the guys. And being, in this sense, held in great respect by the other people. They were actually part themselves at the point of the Suebic Confederacy, because was the largest one, lording over even the Elbe, the lower Elbe basin where the Longobards had settled. But, of course, it was still felt in a sense of, in fact, confederacy, right? A sort of, there was surely a domination there, but a hierarchy, but the Longobards thought of themselves in rather free terms, right, for a while, and they had important room for maneuver. Another aspect is important to stress there is that the Longobards, when they settled in Italy, they had been, yes, Symmachoi federati of the Byzantines, of the Romans, but very distantly from Roman culture. Like Pannonia was in the 6th century and the 5th century, not exactly, particularly Roman pouring kind of source of culture. And so when they settled in Italy, and you can easily see it from an archaeological point of view, we actually have the horse archers buried entirely, right? That they had a pretty central, if not Eastern European, at least in the sense of steppes influenced profile, right? They were really something wild, right? Wild, but still, as we've seen, effective in some ways. Of course, they had been Romanized to some degree. They had been serving, as you know, with the Byzantines in Italy. Actually, there were Longobards settled in the peninsula before 568 already. Some went to other places later on, even after the migration. They as Byzantine Federati to Armenia in the Caucasus. We will see that. But there is no comparison at this point between the Longobards and peoples that had been literally created as monarchies, as armies by the Romans. I mean, the Visigoths, for example, that were literally created as the army of Illyricum. The same Ostrogoths, to some lesser degree actually, but look at the Burgundians, others, etc. They had received this brutally dramatic level of Romanization either, right? They weren't just living fully as Romans. Also because, as we have seen in the multiple videos that I made on late antiquity, things had changed somehow. These peoples were often settled even within Roman territory in areas that had gone uninhabited or that were of strategic importance, thus, generally speaking, less populated, like in the mountains, in the Apennines in this case. Also because Romanity was still alive and functioning in those places civilly. These people made up just the army, right? They simply substituted themselves to the Roman legions. In any case, big divide, right? We cannot look at the term gens for the Visigoths in the same way we look at for the Longobards. They're two very different things. There's surely a lot to talk about this topic because the historiography about how to study properly the migration era peoples today has been mostly hyper discussed. Today probably historiography is moving a little away from the Germanic peoples because they're too white for the tastes of at least the radicalized academia, so everything that has to substantiate in what these peoples were, their actual beliefs, their political cohesion doesn't sound that right. So that's another reason for getting it right instead. There is admittedly a fault, of course, deriving from the pre-World War the second scenario, where naturally there was plenty of fascists, Nazis, racists, whatever, that studied these peoples. And that, especially in look at Ludwig Schmidt, for example, that described these peoples as sort of static greatness, right? They thought that essentially the Germanic confederacies were sort of monolithic groups that were just pure stocks of Aryan people coming to rule over the corrupted South. Naturally, today, also thanks, I must say, in spite of the poor historical quality, even from YouTube, you can understand how different the picture really is. We know how complex these peoples were, but it doesn't mean either that they were so hyper dramatically, multiculturally, heterogeneously, and indistinguishably made up. That's also BS, right? Most of that mentality stems from the fact that, of course, especially the Iranians, as we've seen in the Eurasian Steppes Warfare series, had been pushed west consistently, especially by the by the Huns that had, basically that would come actually to rule over these peoples. Like half of the Germans was under Rome, half of the other one was under the Huns. And some remain even cut in two. The Longobards, however, were apparently some of the peoples who stuck the longest under Attila, and actually specifically his son, and were also more impressed, say, especially in terms of equestrian warfare by them. The point, though, is that, first of all, the Germans were many. But they were not infinite, right? If you look at late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, you realize that these peoples started to move because things were not that great where they lived. There were too few resources, and generally speaking, they risked also during the march to be knocked out. Many died, admittedly. Others were absorbed by other groups, so that's how it works. But if you follow the actual paths again that these peoples followed, especially in the case of the Longobards during the migration, you realize that more or less their path was linear. Okay, admittedly, the Goths were a bit more like the Globetrotters there, but the Longobards literally just moved up the Elbe Valley and arrived in Moravia and Pannonia, and then from there they moved to Italy. I mean, it's not a great movement. They didn't, were broken, rebuilt. Other peoples arrived, superimposed. No, so generally speaking, these groups were pretty compact. If anything, because they were also pretty militarized, which doesn't mean that they weren't including other groups, taking them over literally. But in this sense, you're regimenting them under a pretty hardcore kind of what is called Traditionskern. In fact, in this, what we've been talking about regarding the Origo, actually bearing witness of. And so today, of course, we can appreciate the fact that these peoples mostly would coalesce ethnogenetically as surely groups of others, right? If you look at the Goths, yeah, they may have originated from Scandinavia in terms of the original nucleus that kept ruling more or less the others that found around the way, but hell, no, the majority of the Goths that settled in the Roman Empire were not from Scandinavia, right? They might have been still prevalently German, that I believe, but as you know, as we were saying before, like the Germans that went from the continent to Scandinavia, even just in the original history of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and why is that Scandinavia so important when basically we had the same people even in the south, in other areas, right? So this is not so crucial. For the Longobards, at least it is, because as we were saying before, we have the closest evidence that they were quite likely from Scandinavia, with that certainty that we do not have explicitly from the sources about all these other populations. They surely, however, were building, and this is interesting, the sense that they had been, they had common origins. Now, this is also another interesting topic because some say that objectively the Germans didn't quite have much of a notion of themselves as a whole, right? They were attached, of course, to the various chunks of the Germanic peoples, but the latter term being, in fact, a classical ethnographic invention. Like the first time we have Germans calling themselves German is in Latin in the 6th century, and it's more like in an international context rather than in a local sense of identity. So I'm very much convinced that, in fact, they didn't have, while indeed having a sense of some common origins, they mostly intended them in a moral, spiritual, genetic sense, meaning that what really had made them stuck together as single groups was this moral superiority, moral force that was necessary, again, in the Barbaricum as metus hostilis, just to remain politically and thus militarily cohese, a bit like just study their laws. I mean, the entire sense of the feud, of the revenge in Germanic law is just cutting off, like, let's say, quitting with any breaking of the group as quickly as possible, right? So you killed a member of my clan, I kill one of yours, end of the story. It's fair. It ends there, because if we start making war against one another, our enemies from the external will take advantage of us. It's how paranoid, in a sense, they were. I mean, if you look at Longobard art, for example, this is typical. Like, you have, I don't know, depictions of the universal snake devouring people, limbs scattered everywhere. I mean, that's literally how they saw the world. And considering what was happening in Central Europe, well, it's not very far from reality. And that's, in any case, what the traditional meaning of existence really gets down to. They weren't just, lazing off, right? And this went in parallel with the obvious knowledge that, yes, the Germanic peoples began to strengthen themselves also because of the waves of Scandinavians that mostly could not survive just with the local resources, so different waves that either we don't understand whether it was just a political thing or a climatic thing or both, but humans can always mess up things much better than climate does. It's overrated indeed, even for this incredibly fragile agricultural economies. They would have descended from this great north. I mean, the myth of the hyperboreal sea in the Aryan mythology, the sense of the place where of pure light, of the great icy mountain, right? Also where the Asgard. I mean, it's the sense of divine perfection, sort of heaven on earth, at least the point of contact probably between earth and heaven, where the heroes live and so on. So the North Pole and Scandinavia, this far northern area, was, just was surely traveled to, but still remained somehow at the outskirts of the same classical geographical knowledge, represented surely the archetypal locality of where properly the race of gods would have sprung from, right? The Romans called Scandinavia a vagina of peoples because they knew that these movements had started from these groups that had eventually pressed from the north, also desperately enough in the already militarized continent, and had gradually expanded throughout other paths, right? Consider that the Germans had, or the Goths especially, because at some point you also can distinguish them. They were really different groups to some degree, had carved out their own powerful Pontic power in Crimea that had been riding the empire, the Mediterranean, the eastern provinces. So there was a sense of heroism, even marching towards the east. I made a video about the Ostrogoths and their past, let's say, and we've seen how the cultic awareness of the imperial tradition was incredibly alive among these people. I made lots of videos really explaining the unitary identity of the imperial virtus for both the Germans and the Romans. I mean, it's a very famous ethnographic topos. People should be aware of that, like about their ABC when talking about this topic. So the fact that the gens was made up also by a natio, so in Latin, literally the place where you had been born, right? And that at this point was intended more in a romantic sense, because of course these people were not born in Scandinavia. I mean, the ones that stepped into Italy, if not some, we know some groups admittedly were, but the majority was on the continent for much longer time, was shared by the Germans. Again, that far north, the hyperboreal sea was understood to be there, was understood to be an uncompromised place, as primitive as unspoiled in their view, where everything had begun, in a way. So it's a bit between myth and reality, between history and legend, but surely there is both at the same time, and so it's consistent in a way with their belief. Some people say, well, it's just a fiction because these groups were surely open, unstable, they were changing, so there is a lot of an irrational mythical religious ethos here. Well, here we pass to the other aspect, because one thing is believing, of course, that your people had ancestrally emigrated from Scandinavia. Another thing means what is left of them, right? You see that they were a stock, right? They were concerned of their common ancestry, and this was understood in a spiritual sense. right? Moral resources are more important, right? These people were not Gnostics. They believed perfectly well that the apotheosis could happen only by managing to transform the flesh, right? So it's all absolutely clear to them what, of course, the Catholic belief really was. There were minor divergences also with Arianism that really intended like things to a different degree, but not to a radical difference from what, again, was just their own belief that this could be possible to achieve individually. And the sense was, in fact, in the most traditional vein, transfigurational. In other words, they believed that this group, as long as it would remain morally oriented and with this also genetic, physical, biological base intact as a core, right, it would be able to transfigure the world. This is why eventually the Franks and the Ottonians took the term Roman for them, because Rome had been the only empire that had managed to conquer the world and thus repristinating the Golden Age through the apotheosis. So the idea is that this could happen once again. And every people had been believing in this capacity originally, especially these warlike ones. They were closer to that state of mind. So it was enough for the political, military, and social core of, in this case, say, the Longobards, when, for example, crushing another people in battle and basically subjugating it, literally making it become Longobard. Right? They would essentially select the people who had been, especially the women, right, that had survived, or the men would hopefully die in battle if they were true heroes. But in that sense, this proof had meant just to have elevated oneself to the same, above the greatness of these enemy warriors, and then in gravitating their own women, daughters, wives, whatever, is all the story also of Rosamund and Alboin and all the tensions, by the way, existing. Even between these ethnic groups, you understand the gaps in that didn't exist anymore after they were crashed, but of course in the first generations they still remember that they had been another people, right? But they were all one. In fact, even the Saxons that were allies with the Longobards descended to Italy during the same invasion in 568 with 20,000 men. The Longobards basically told them, look, if you want to stay here, you have to become Longobards. And the Saxons said, we don't want to, and they came back north of the Alps, right? But there were also Longobard royal dynasties of Thuringian origin. For example, Agilulf was actually that in case. There were some, we know, Swabians that had been adopted by the Longobards and that actually served the Byzantines later on. So the most important thing was, of course, that there was a chosen people that was superior to the others and lorded over these subjects, but that were kept under the same Longobard imperium, essentially, for which they would just augment their power, and through that, eventually coming to conquer all the other peoples in the world, hopefully, ideally. And it surely was a bit difficult to do that just after the greatest empire had just collapsed and all the moral and physical exhaustion had followed. But the sense is that this race had to rejuvenate also the Roman decadence in a way, and so hopefully transfiguring this, which, if you think again about the Lombards, against the Holy Roman Emperor in the 12th century, winning, on the battlefield, fighting for their own liberty. Like you may think that actually that would have been at least very, very perspective opinion if you think about it, but it's still in the 12th century what they actually believed, right? So there is no way to simply downplay these stories as, oh my god, they were just indoctrinating themselves into thinking that they were Longobards, even if they were not. We do not have a demographic evidence of how many of the originary Vinili, or even just the ones that inhabited the Bardengau, eventually made up the 100 to 300,000 once they migrated into Italy, surely with lots of other people. We know, obviously, many other Germans, Saxons, Thuringians, whatever. We know of Sarmatians, we know of Huns, we know of Slavs. We know of Romanized populations, by the way. So they would all become Longobards in a way. That's a shaded issue, right? And very often this is not documented. What really matters, and evidently mattered to them, though, was the fact that that was this core, that these people as a whole, this gens, who was Longobard. And this is a huge deal. So the elites were the ones in charge of this representation. If you want, they had to stick to the standards, live and die according to the values of the people. That was all one in terms of law, right? How they married into each other, how they made peace among them or other people. So the conventional right internationally, domestically, where they would live, how they would organize during the migration, considered the logistics of this all, right? Admittedly, these groups were autonomous, as we were just saying. They found literally their own resources locally, but they also had to organize where to settle, which groups were, which functions to have, even in the frontier with other peoples. We would have to maintain the tradition, the knowledge of it, that was sacred, evidently. The language, right? Longobard language is beautiful. It was hissing, right? It was an Elb. Sometimes you find the term that Longobards were East German. They weren't. They were Elb Germans. That depends on the division. Sometimes you just don't see the Elb Germans. It's either West or East. But the Elb Germans would be essentially the Bavarians, the Alemanni, right? That's basically today's southern Germany. Linguistical legacy. Well, the Longobards were basically that. The language went extinct in Italy, but when they again wrote in Latin, sometimes they used certain Germanisms or entire German words, and so we know also consistently well what this sounded like, or at least what we think it would. It's it's very complicated, the topic. There are this we should ask somebody else. I'm not an expert in linguistics, etc., but I know something, and we could talk about it here and there. And of course, political objectives. The mere need of survival, moving, and not being crushed by other peoples who threatened, and being in diplomatic relations with the Romans, fighting for them, and plus think of all the conflicts that existed internally. We know that, right? But to them, the single most important aspect was the deep conviction of the common ancestry. And the reason is obvious. They believed all to descend from a chosen group, right? One that had basically emanated as an offspring, right, from a common ancestor who was the closest to God. And so being a chosen people as such. The people of Woden. So lots of studies have been made about this topic, so I'm making it relatively simple, but I'm deeply convinced, just through also history of religions, that this was the actual meaning they attributed to the concept. There are many other scholars we could mention, Wolfram, Vence, let's say. There are some, say, the same early medieval passages of Isidore of Seville, for example, that sound something like gens est multitudo ab uno principio horta sive, ab alia natione secundum propriam collectionem distincta. Right? There are other authors who see instead in these groups polyethnic federation, I would say the most important thing in terms of how they actually kept the thing together was the army, right? These were a warlike people, so the concept of exercitus, that in fact in the Longobard law becomes synonym to populus exercitus. So the concept that these were freemen in arms, so people that were free, thus noble, because only the better people are free. The others are under, right? And so those who could bear arms were also noble to a degree. This is a concept that survives in the same Italian communes that from Longobard times were all traditionally free citizenry. Also from Roman times, telling the truth, and there surely had been an ambiguity at the beginning between the Longobards that thought to be the, as Germans, juridically the superior people, the conquerors, but that then immediately in the first generations already extended the Longobard identity to these people that evidently proved to have that power of arms themselves, because we evidently realized that these cities were, proud. We know it from their epigraphies. We know that they had militias. We see it also in Longobard military history. So these were mostly like the local Romans that had turned Longobard and represented, say, exalted in their merit for that matter. So we've seen this often, because the actual future of the Germanic peoples north of the Alps would have been the one of basically falling under the aristocracies. This happens during the early Middle Ages, clearly, right? There is no such thing like free people. Like mostly there is an elite and the others are, say, somebody else's people, right? Their people, as a matter of fact. Historically, in Italy, you do not quite find this. You find instead the highest level of individual liberty. And this had to do actually with the highest degree of per capita wealth in the world, uninterruptedly from Roman times. But it has also to do definitely with the superimposition of the Longobard values that had somehow salvaged the sense of Germanic freedom and applied it to the local inhabitants as well. This allowed, again, the kingdom to be particularly solid, not perturbed by civil wars, by private clienteles of feudal, proto-feudal character, like in Visigothic Spain or Merovingian, Carolingian even, Gaul. Here you have an incredibly orderly system where, at best, the aristocrats compete for civil career within the city on behalf of the king. This system was light years ahead civilizationally from, say, the Franks, and that's also part of the reason why Charlemagne, aside from the great respect that he had for the Longobards, decided to become their king, right? Unlike any other people of the Carolingian Empire that wasn't au pair with the Franks, here instead you have the emperor being such, but king of the Franks and of the Longobards, and associating to the Italic crown the imperial one as well, right? For reaching Rome and being crowned by the Pope. So there is no doubt that the origin of the gens is a matter of constitution rather than strictly of blood, right? Surely there was somebody that was being convinced of having Longobard ancestry and that actually didn't along the way in Central Europe. But they also were objectively very homogeneous peoples. And we see the Longobards emerging fundamentally with that re-emerging historically in the 6th century on the Danube, already with that kind of level of political profile of liberty, right? They may have been under the Huns, but the Huns needed them intact, and probably the Longobards also profited from that domination that relied so much on this group. We will see, hopefully in other videos, how also dynamic the Longobards were. As I was saying before, again, after Arminius' assassination, it seems that this small but warlike people was chosen by the other Germans as the moderators of the situation, and that's quite fascinating, telling the truth. So looking at this very rich legacy in the history of the West, it's difficult not to appreciate the let's say the redemptional value that this identity embodied, right? Defeating somebody and giving them the chance, right, of redeeming themselves. And this is what the Longobards apparently did, because the myth of the origin says this. We'll see it, that they where the Longobards were too few at a point where were threatened, they through an initiatory rite that said, putting, I think, the arrow tip on somebody, on the slave shoulders. Basically, they elevated them to warriors, and this won their freedom on the battlefield, right? So it's, again, a bit like the Roman citizenship sense in terms of military service, etc. It's this literally transfiguring value that holy war has on even the forsaken, right? Remember that these people were, those who were conquered, did not belong to themselves anymore. So there was no contact way back to God possible, if not through the medium of these rulers. And that's why the success of the Longobards was so important overall. Their survival, their compaction, because it showed to those that they had conquered were capable of that constant rejuvenation that is at the base of the concept of the gens offspring, right? And so it's always the perpetuation of a moral race of superior people. That this is an incredibly powerful concept. So the political military connection there is evident. The exercitus is made up by those who can afford fighting, defending the community, and it overlaps with largely with the gens. At least, if you count the fact that, contrarily to what some sort of oddly, but that's the point. I mean, feministic neo-Nazis, because it's still National Socialism. Socialism. Never forget about that. Germanic women didn't have any freedom. In tradition, the woman cannot transfigure by itself. Her only way to do that is being possessed, right, by the man, entering this antagonistic but also complicit connection and going back to the one as such, right? But in Germanic society, women belong to men, and they at best have juridical autonomy. Actually, the Longobards gave great importance to women, but in the sense that they also protected them very much, right? But they couldn't do, admittedly, in Italy, they were actually much more entrepreneurial than, say, the Norse women really were. We see it from charters, from the fact that women were given by men will in the testaments the possibility of running, of enjoying at least a farm, a property, some land plot, whatever. But of course, a woman could act exclusively, by action of a man, right? A man decided what she was allowed to be done. And this has nothing to do with Christianization, as this paranoid Nazi, radically underschooled people who do not even study Germanic law, because of course, their upbringing did not allow them to, can't believe that, this was a fruit of some sort of Christian imposition. Study Indo-European tradition, you imbecile, right? And this is the actual point. We should stop pretending that people's opinion matter anything if they are wrong, right? The fact that everybody's entitled to have an opinion does have anything to do with the worthlessness of opinions. And the Longobards understood this perfectly. Because if you are not free to act normally, you will and cut down to pieces on a battlefield. And there is plenty of this, in fact, in the Longobard history, which we'll see beautifully. In any case, it's the unitarity of the people that matters. The fact that altogether this system was functional as such, together with the female, with those who could not fight anyway, the very elderly, the kids, and all those people that naturally followed during the migration era, the system, the people, in arms, right? So again, the Romans had been the same identical thing. The Romans were a body of citizens in arms, but were thus embodied with a nobiliar, imperial sense. We've seen it in the video about the struggles between the patricians and the plebeians, how the consular faculty was accorded also to the people, and so from there on, Rome took off and subjugated basically the surrounding world for 400 years without end. So this speaks volumes about the Indo-European foundation of these peoples, the deep connection existing between, violence and civic rights, right? The citizens in arms, what this really means. Warriors do not make it. There must be this common level of, cohesion. Otherwise, the individual goes nowhere. That's also why the Longobards do not entrust themselves just to a single guy that has to take over everything. But they manage, which if would have succeeded, would have been perfectly traditional in the sense that the others would have not been worth defending their own liberty, as it happened to the Gambids, to other peoples, but not the Longobards, because a Longobard would not whine about some strange conspiracy theory for which they're too weak to rise to power themselves, like the average self-styled conservative or traditionalist pretends to point out. They would just go and get it. That's what tradition actually says. Right? It's the sole foundation of tradition is action, not whining about bullshit. So this elements of the unitary consciousness were deeply rooted in the Longobard people, up to the point that even after hundreds of years after the settlement, their full Christianization, whatever, for them it was normal to know them. It was normal just to be part of a community that shared those values and that was cemented by it, right? Admittedly, things change over time. Things do not simply work by legions and tales and so on, so that actually the Longobards are, witnessing the same issues against the Franks that have at least developed a professional military system, which admittedly was the exception in Latin Germanic Europe at that point. So it's not just the Longobards who would pay of that, but let's say they weren't just a simply softened up people that they said, oh my god, now they counted nothing just because they got destroyed by the Franks. Well, that's not quite correct, right? And actually, Charlemagne was pretty concerned about maintaining his power in the Longobard kingdom after the conquest, so that he had to rush a couple of times where rebellions broke up there. And he sent the very best of the Frankish nobility to Italy, differently from other places in the empire. So we will have way to talk about this, especially for the video about the Battle of the Livenza River. What we see here is just the equation between the exercitus, the gens, and so this historically, ethnically, traditional, virile, Uranian principle, which, as a van der Lawine, as we call it in, at least in Germanistics, right? and constitute, in fact, the last great migration in Western Europe, right? Then other places east had issues. The same Longobards at a point settled a bunch of roaming Bulgars right in the southern end of their domains, but they embodied to a degree which is calibrated between modernity and tradition to a point that it's difficult to be seen, right? Just objectively, the Merovingian, Gallo-Roman, Germanic synthesis will be able to do more, right, and to revive fully. And I made a video exactly on this, as the Merovingians as a bit like the spring of European civilization, at least as far as this post-Roman times is this. It's a second shot, basically, in the attempt of reconstituting the Catholic Empire was given. But also the Longobards would have a role in this. Right? You can argue that from some details. There were elite Longobard forces from the duchies sent here and there, and in Bavaria and in Saxony, but it's another time, it's another place. What matters, though, is the fact that throughout this time and more and beyond, the unitary belief of the Longobard identity remained very, very strong. And studying their history will bring us closer to the reason of such political cohesion that is at the base of every single civilizational success. Alright, I'm glad we talked about this topic today. It's just the beginning, something more consistent. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you heartily for listening to me, as always. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.